communication is our superpower, right? Homo sapiens have succeeded because we communicate so well. And our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication. And as a result, when we learn a skill and we practice it once or twice or three times, it becomes a habit very, very quickly. Our brain is basically designed to make these skills into habits almost immediately.
Mhm.
And so it can feel overwhelming when someone describes it to us. But if you just practice it a little bit,
Right.
it becomes incredibly habitual.
Sure.
So, and just so folks listening know, so a deep question is this thing from psychology that asks someone about their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And you're exactly right. That's a great deep question because it doesn't seem overly intrusive. It just seems curious, but it invites me to say something meaningful. And so in my case, so I went to HBS to get an MBA, and in the year between my first and second year, that summer, I went back to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I grew up, to work with a private equity company that did real estate. And so my job was that every morning I'd wake up and I would start building spreadsheets, looking at various properties, trying to figure out which ones we should bid on. In particular, they love to buy hotels and golf courses. And as anyone who's built spreadsheets knows, it's not the most exciting activity. And so I would let myself listen to a This American Life, that
Oh,
podcast. And
yeah.
this is like 20 years ago. So is it like
Right.
not podcasts weren't as popular. I'd let myself listen to one This American Life to kind of like help pass the time. And if it was a really tough day, I'd let myself listen to two of them. And I
Mhm.
got to the end of the summer and I was like, if the best part of my day is listening to a podcast at this job, I should probably go make podcasts or write stories rather than build spreadsheets. And so that was kind of the decision that I made. During my second year at HBS. I decided I wanted to become a journalist, in part because I just thought it would be really interesting. And I thought that the question of how to tell stories would be something that captivated me for the rest of my life. And so yeah, for the first like 7 years after we graduated, I think I was the lowest paid member of our graduating class from HBS.
Mhm.
Luckily, things have changed since then, and
Right.
it's worked out pretty well. But yeah, that's how I decided to become a journalist, and I have to say it was a fantastic choice. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, you've done incredibly well with I think The Power of Habit has sold over 10,000,000 copies, is that am
Yeah,
I close?
yeah, no,
That's
it's great.
incredible. I have gotta say I'm a little intimidated to be interviewing you.
You shouldn't
You've
be.
been on Rich Roll and, all these, like, Lewis Howes, and, it's just really cool to be able to talk. But, were you always into writing, like, as a kid, like, in high school and
Yeah.
college? Did you enjoy the actual process of writing?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I find writing very satisfying. And what's interesting is I've looked at a lot of studies about this because one of my kids is a big reader and writer, and the other kid
Mhm.
is really into sports. And we tend to think that some people that our brains are predisposed to something. Actually, that's not true. What we
Mhm.
found is that particularly when we're young, we find a method of self-soothing,
Mhm.
and that method of self-soothing becomes a habit. So it's not that you're born bookish or you're born sporty. It's that
Right.
when you're trying to deal with like excess energy and excess, you almost by happenstance happen to pick up a book or happen to pick up a basketball.
Mhm.
And the more and more you do that, the more it becomes ingrained. This is a way to kind of comfort myself, to like push myself to find interest in the world. And so I think for me, because my parents weren't particularly sporty, that books and writing was a way of self-soothing that I came to very young. And so I've always kind of enjoyed it as a result.
I wanted to hear a little bit about you when you came out with The Power of Habit, huge bestseller. You were also a Pulitzer Prize winner that same year. I think, what was that,
Yeah.
2013 or
13.
14?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that experience of achieving that kind of level of success that anybody listening to this is like pushing and trying to improve and, reaching for these ambitious goals. Talk
Yeah.
to me about that process and what it was like for you.
I mean, I'm obviously very, very thankful. I'm very thankful that I've won a Pulitzer Prize. I'm very thankful that The Power of Habit found an audience. I will say that was actually one of the hardest years of my life, because I think what happens is that for success to be best appreciated, it should really come slowly. But sometimes it happens all of a sudden, right? Sometimes you spend a bunch of time writing a book and the book comes out and it's a bestseller, which is great.
Yeah.
Sometimes you write a series and it wins the Pulitzer Prize. And what happens is that all of a sudden there's a whole new set of opportunities that become open to you, but they're all happening so quickly that you're unprepared to deal with them.
Mhm.
So there's a bunch of stuff that sort of you wish that you could take advantage of and you can't just because you're literally overwhelmed and you don't have enough time. There's other stuff that you do try and take advantage of, but you don't know enough yet how to really use that opportunity and how to make it sustainable. And so that what I felt that year when The Power of Habit came out and I won the Pulitzer Prize, it felt like a year where like I was just screwing up all the time. Like like finally life had served up this like cherry cake to me on a silver platter, and instead of eating it I was like throwing it, throwing it into my smashing it against my face. And so that was really really challenging. Now, that being said, it's a good experience because I think that as my career developed and as I wrote more books and now with with the super communicators, I'm much better prepared to take advantage of and recognize and understand those opportunities. But I will say that the thing about success is sometimes the way I used to put it is the thing about success is that you take something you love to do and you're suddenly successful at it, and then you have to do it all the time, right? Like
Right.
the reward of success is that you get to write as many books as you want, but that means you have to
Yep.
write more books.
Right.
And so there are challenges involved in it. I think as with many things in life, when things happen slowly, it can feel like a little frustrating that they're not moving faster, but there's a real lesson in value from that slowness in that it lets you really learn and adapt to the changes around you.
Tell me a little bit about, like, the pressures to write that 2nd book or the 3rd book. You've had this in many ways, like, maybe having an instant like, the 1st book being such a huge success can be it's almost like the worst thing that could happen because now you've got these expectations of having another huge hit. Tell me about that. Like, what
Yeah, I
did
mean,
that did you feel that pressure?
well, let me ask you, like when you've had successes, the was whatever you did next, was it as big a success?
It's a good question. So I've been involved in real estate and it's all project based. So it's similar to writing a book, I guess.
Yeah,
Each one's different. It's
each
it's
one's
hard
different,
to each one's totally different.
and there's
And I
probably
try
a
not to put too much expectation on what I do. It's just like
yeah.
do your work, put it out into the world, and it's going to do what it does.
I think
You
that's
can't
right, and
really,
I'm sure you've
you,
had one building that's like been a huge success, and then the next building is fine,
eh,
right? It
right?
like does fine. It's not as big a success as that first one, but I think you're exactly right. The thing that you learn about life is that if you focus on the process rather than the outcomes,
Mhm.
you tend up having more success, right?
Yeah.
That the goal here is not to say like I absolutely want to write another bestseller. The goal here is to write the best book you can write.
Mhm.
And if you do that and you're lucky, it will be a bestseller. But there's so much you can't control, right? You
Right.
could have a great building deal and you put it together and then you come out to market right as a recession starting. And that doesn't
Exactly.
mean that
Right.
you did a bad job on that deal. It just means your timing was unlucky and we
Yeah.
can't control luck. So what I tend to do is I tend to focus on the things I can control
Mhm.
and then just feel very grateful when it does work out, but not take it as a symbol of like of failure if it doesn't, as long as I believe that the process I've been disciplined about looking at the process, about analyzing the process, about learning from my mistakes. That's I think the best you can hope for in life.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I heard Morgan Housel say that only write a book if you absolutely have to. Like it's just been burning and cooking within you. Talk to me a little bit about your latest book, Super Communicators. Was that a book
Yeah.
that you had to write? How
Oh
did that
yeah.
unfold?
No, absolutely. So the Power of Habit and Supercommunicators both came from the same place, which is me trying to figure out how to solve a problem in my own life. And with
Mhm.
Supercommunicators, it was that I fell into this bad pattern where I would come home from work and I would start complaining to my wife about my day. And she very reasonably, she would say something like, here's a solution. Why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other?
Mhm.
And instead of being able to hear her good advice, I would get even more upset, right? And I would say, like, why aren't you listening to me? You should be
Right.
supporting me. You should be outraged on my behalf. She would get upset that I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And everyone who's listening, you've had this own pattern in your own relationships, right? This is like, and so I went to these researchers, these neurologists, and I said, like, look, I'm a professional communicator. Why do I keep making the same mistake over and over and over again? And they said, well, it's actually good that you came and asked us because we're living through this golden age of understanding the science of communication, really for the first time because of advances in neural imaging and data collection. And they said, one of the things that we've learned is that most people, when we have a discussion, we think that discussion is about one thing, right? That
Mhm.
discussion is about, my day or our kids' grades or where we should go on vacation. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations.
Mhm.
And these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's practical conversations where we're solving problems or we're making plans together. But then there's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we react to each other and interact and social identities that are important to us and how we see society. And they said, what happens is that if you're having all those different kinds of conversations are all equally legitimate. But if you're having different kinds of conversations at the same time, you literally can't hear each other. It's as if you're using different parts of your brains.
Mhm.
And so when I was coming home from work and I was having an emotional conversation and my wife was responding with a practical conversation, they're both equally legitimate conversations, but we can't hear each other. We can't
Yeah.
connect with each other. And this has become what's known as the matching principle in psychology, that good communication requires figuring out what kind of conversation is happening and then matching each other. And once you do that, then you can move from emotional to social to practical to back to emotional together and you become aligned. What's known in neurology as or neuroscience as neurally entrained.
Mhm.
And that's when a good conversation occurs. That's when we feel connected to each other.
It reminds me of there's a great Saturday Night Live skit that I'm sure you've seen, like, the woman has a nail in her head, and she's
Yeah.
talking about how she feels so bad, and the guy's just like, not she just wants to have him, understand how
Empathize.
she feels, and he's just trying to solve the problem right
And
off
he's
the
like
bat,
he's
like,
like,
"Take the damn nail out of your head."
"Yeah,
Like, you
you have a nail in your head." And she's like,
Right.
"That's not the problem. You're not listening to me." Right?
Right, right. Yeah, it's a good thing. So I can see the book and how the design of it. I wanted to hear a little bit first, like, tell me about the design of the cover of the
Oh,
book,
the cover? Oh my
and then
gosh.
just like after that, I want to just hear like just a definition of like what is a super communicator.
Sure. So the cover, I mean, and anyone who's ever written a book, they know this. The hardest things is like coming up with the cover and the
Right,
title. Like you work
right.
forever trying to figure out. And we just kicked around the idea again and again and again. And eventually this seemed like it was kind of like it would work. Like it sort of
Mhm.
explains the concept of building
Yeah.
and now what a super communicator is, it's a great question. And I'll actually ask you a question in order to illustrate this. So if you were having a bad day
Hmm.
and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, right? That
Yeah.
that talking to them would help. Do you know who you would call?
One of two people. Yeah, I've got two people
Okay.
that I would. One would be my wife, and then another good buddy of mine.
Okay. So for you, your wife and that buddy, they are super communicators. They
Yes, they
know
are.
they know exactly what to ask you. They know how
Hmm.
to cheer you up or pose a tough question. They know how to connect with you and you are probably a super communicator back for them, right? You know how to do that in your conversations. We are all super communicators at one time or another. We all have those conversations with a friend where we know exactly what to ask, or we're going into a meeting and we know exactly how to pitch our idea in a way that it's going to get everyone else on board. But there are some people who can do this consistently. There's some people who can do this in any setting. And what's interesting is when I started working on this book, I assumed those people would be extroverts or really charming or they would
Hmm.
be born with the gift of gab. And that's not true at all. In fact, it's basically a
So
normal
it's not
distribution.
a it's not a I mean, all of this is learnable. It's not a nature nurture
It's
thing. It's not like you're
all
born with
it's
it.
it's all learnable skills. What those people have learned is that the skills you're using with your wife and the skills you're using with your friend,
Mhm.
once we recognize them as skills, we can use them with anyone
Right.
and we can connect with anyone. And that's what a super communicator is. A super communicator is someone who's learned to recognize the skills that allow them to connect with others. And the book, Super Communicators, is an explanation of those skills and how to practice them.
So let's get into that. What are some of those skills that like these super communicators do that the average person neglects or doesn't think about, or it's just not on
Yeah.
their radar?
So one of the first is that supercommunicators, consistent supercommunicators, they tend to ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person.
Mhm.
And some of those questions are questions like, "Oh, what'd you say next?" Or, "Oh,
Yeah.
what'd you think about that?" Right? Questions that are kind of designed to invite us in. But some of the questions are deep questions, questions that ask about our values and our beliefs and our experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating to people, but it's as simple as, if you bump into someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them, "Where do you practice medicine?" asking them, "Oh, what made you decide to become a doctor?
Mhm.
Like what do you love about your practice?"
Yeah.
Right? Those are questions that invite me to tell you something meaningful about who I am. So that's one of the first skills is ask deep questions.
Mhm. Yeah, I shared with you, I went to this networking event last night, and it was a bunch of accountants, right? And I went into it like, "Oh, this is gonna be so boring." And, but I'd read the book, and I just started just asking this guy that I was talking with just a bunch of questions, like, and the first one was exactly like that. "How did you decide to become an accountant?" Which led to him talking about his dad, who was a cop and who wanted him to be a cop, and then guns, and then growing up in Cleveland, and like all these, I just got him talking about himself. And, as you
Yeah.
know, like people's favorite topic is generally themselves. Um, do you ever feel that like some of this can be manipulative though? Like learning these skills can be used for like, manipulating people?
Well, let me ask something about that conversation last night when you were asking. My guess is, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. My guess is that you asked those questions, and he talked about growing up in Cleveland, and you also shared something about yourself, right? You kind of answered those questions even if they weren't posed to you, like, "Oh, this is what it was like
Yes.
growing up in Cleveland for me," and "Oh, I
Hmm.
decided to go into real estate." Not my dad wasn't a cop; he was a ex, and so there was probably this reciprocal authenticity, this reciprocal, even
Yeah.
maybe even vulnerability. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, definitely some vulnerability. We got into talking about kids and the challenges of raising kids in today's society. And even, we were talking about, I drove by the kids at the bus stop and they were all just on their phones having no communication at all with each other. So, yeah, I mean, there was some shared, commonalities, obviously, that we were sharing.
Yeah, and so it's not really an interview, it's a dialogue. And so to your
Right.
point about manipulation, so the first thing I'll say is communication is a tool, right? And like much like an axe can be used to build a house. An axe can also be used to cut
Yeah.
someone's head off, right? It has a lot to do with the wielder of that tool and not the tool itself.
Mhm.
That being said, these concerns about manipulation through communication, oftentimes, what studies show is that they don't materialize very frequently, right? So take scam artists.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of studies done of scam artists. The person that they scam, they never say, "Oh, I believed his story." What
Yeah.
they say
Right.
is, "I was really lonely, and so I was willing to like pretend I believed his crazy story because I wanted to hang out with someone. He brought something to my life that was real and authentic."
Hmm.
The way that our brains evolved is that in addition to being very, very good at communication, our brains have evolved to be excellent at communication. They've also evolved to be very good at detecting inauthenticity. And that actually makes sense because, eons ago, if a stranger comes to your village and he pretends to be friendly, but he's not, that's really dangerous. So we all have a hair trigger in our brain for inauthenticity.
Right.
And and that usually works pretty well. If we've all been to that party where someone asks us where we went on vacation and we realize within like 10 seconds, they don't care where we went on vacation. They just want to tell us where they went on vacation, right? And brag about the yacht they rented.
Right. Right.
So it's very hard to manipulate people through conversation without them recognizing that they're being manipulated. And so we don't need to be worried about that. What is a much bigger worry is that at those times that you want to be authentic, you want to create a real connection, that if you don't recognize the skills that allow you to, that you falter at it. So it's actually the opposite of manipulation where I want to be genuine with you. I want to really share with you and I want you to share with me. And I don't know how to get over the hump to do so.
What are some of the challenges that pose people for, or present to people to becoming a super communicator? Like as I'm listening to you, I'm also, there's a part of me that's like, what am I going to ask next, which is taking me away from being completely present and focused on what you're saying. So talk to me a little bit about just some of the challenges that people have to developing this skill of being a super communicator.
Well, I would actually say I don't think you have to think about what am I going to ask next. So
Right.
I used to have a podcast with Slate,
Mhm.
and one of the things that was great is that you have a producer who's listening to all of the interviews, and the
Right.
producer sometimes is like coming up with questions and sending them to you if you're not thinking about them yourself. But
Mhm.
what I found was that the best interviews I did is when I would get in the moment of the interview so thoroughly that
Right.
sometimes the person would stop speaking, and it took me a couple seconds to figure out what I actually wanted to ask next. And the
Mhm.
magic of podcasts is that we can edit out that silence, right? But
Right.
in the conversations we have in real life, oftentimes if we're really in the middle of that conversation, very present for that conversation, someone says something and we say something like, that's really interesting. Let me think for a second. Or we might repeat back what they've said. What I hear you saying is this,
Mhm.
right? It's okay to kind of be thoughtless in a conversation. That means that you are in the conversation. It's when we start thinking about other people watching the conversation or analyzing the conversation or evaluating the conversation, when you start thinking too much about your audience and not this back and
Right.
forth,
Yep.
that's when things kind of can go off the rails. And
Mhm.
sometimes the audience is the person we're talking to, right? If I come into a conversation, I say, my goal is to impress you that I'm smart, or my goal is that I want you to like me or agree with me,
Mhm.
then I'm not necessarily having a conversation with you where we're trying to understand each other. I'm seeing you as a participant, but also as my audience. And so I'm trying to
Right.
perform for you. And
Right.
that performance is where the inauthenticity comes from.
Right. Now I don't know what to say. No.
That's okay. That's okay. See, that's a very natural thing. Is that like that's what a real conversation does. And
Right.
with more practice, what's interesting is if you look at transcripts from great conversations, the
Mhm.
transcripts are terrible. Like you look at it and you're like, oh, this did not sound like a good conversation. It's like half completed sentences and people saying the wrong thing. And then you ask people about the conversation, they're like, oh, it's great. I loved having that conversation.
Right.
It's
Right.
because we're not necessarily great at saying our ideas in the most eloquent way possible in the moment. But that's okay. When we connect with each other, it's not about eloquence. It's about connection.
Exactly. And I wanted to hear a little bit as you were doing the research for this book. Were there any heroes that you developed that you surprised you that like this guy, I
Yeah.
want to emulate this guy or this
Oh,
woman
yeah. No,
and I
absolutely.
want
There's a
to
guy
like become like them as a communicator?
Yeah, yeah, there's a guy named Nicholas Epley who's in the book. He's basically spent his whole life studying deep questions, but also studying listening.
Mhm.
And we tell the story in the book of growing up. He actually got pulled over for DUIs twice,
Mhm.
as a teenager,
Right.
and basically his parents would like lecture him and try and break through, and it just didn't work. And so he went to this. They made him go to this counselor, and she just asked him a bunch of questions. And asking those questions, particularly deep questions, that seemed to unlock something inside of him. And he started listening to himself and listening to other people. But Nick is one of these guys who you spend time with, and he's just a wonderful human being. Like he embodies everything we're talking about. In fact, one of my favorite aspects of him is, so he has either 5 or 6 kids, and a number of them are adopted.
Mm.
Um, and I think when people adopt, there's often like a sensitivity around the conversation of adoption. Either they don't bring it up or you don't want to imply that adopting is different from not adopting. But what's wonderful about Nick is like this, he'll tell you, he's like, I have 6 children, and 2 of them are from Ethiopia and one's from China. And he's so comfortable with it. And the one from China, they actually, they had gotten pregnant. He's told this story publicly, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. They'd gotten pregnant and they discovered that their baby was going to have Down syndrome,
Mhm.
and they kind of dealt with everything about that, and then they miscarried. Um, and afterwards, his wife said, "We're prepared to take a baby into our home who has Down syndrome." And it turns out it's like that's going to be less of a life change than we sort of had worried it would be.
Mhm.
I think we should adopt a child with Downs.
Mhm.
And that's what they did. They adopted this wonderful girl, this little girl
Oh,
from China. He is someone who is so present and so honest and so vulnerable and so real. And just being around that feels good, right?
Mhm.
It feels instructive to be around someone who brings so much of themselves to a conversation. And so I've tried to emulate that.
So talk more about that, the importance of being vulnerable with somebody. A lot of us have just a fear of being vulnerable and sharing, maybe view it as weakness potentially, or just really have a tough time being open and honest and truthful about our human experience.
Hey guys, it's Clay Fink here, host of We Study Billionaires. Today, I wanted to tell you about our show sponsor, Vacasa. The dream of owning a vacation home can be daunting. From finding the best guests, to the maintenance, to organizing the cleaners after every guest stay. With Vacasa, they make that dream into a reality. As a full-service vacation home management company with vacation homes in key destinations across the US, they know how to make owning a vacation home easy and profitable. On top of proactive property maintenance visits by professional local teams, a data-driven booking platform, and around-the-clock support, homeowners earn on average 20% more revenue from their vacation homes. Vacasa makes vacation home ownership easy. If you're looking to make more from your vacation homes by doing less, partner with Vacasa at vacasa.com. That's vacasa.com.
Well, and it's important to specify what vulnerability is, because I think there's a misconception.
Mhm.
Vulnerability does not mean like crying in public or talking about like,
Right.
the worst experience of your life. What vulnerability is it's a feeling when I say something that you could judge, regardless of whether I care if you judge or not. So if I tell you, I like Star Trek better than Star Wars, that doesn't seem like that big a deal, but it's a vulnerable admission
Mhm.
because it presents an opportunity where you could be like, "Are you joking? Like,
Right.
that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Now, I might not care about your judgment. I might be like, "I don't care what you think about it. This is how I feel."
Mhm.
But the fact that I've said something that opens me to your judgment is vulnerability. It feels vulnerable. And at that moment, you have a choice. And the choice is you can either rebuff that vulnerability or you can reciprocate it. And you can reciprocate it by saying, "Oh, you've given me an opportunity to judge you.
Mhm.
Let me return the favor." And say, "Actually, I like Star Wars more than Star Trek, and here's why." And that gives me a chance to judge you. You're not saying you're dumb, I'm smart. You're
Mhm.
saying I have a difference of opinion. That's vulnerability. And there's this thing that's been hardwired into our brain by evolution, which is that when when I am vulnerable and you engage in reciprocal vulnerability, I trust you more and I like you
Mhm.
more. I'm almost powerless to not do this. And so this is one of the things that we know about vulnerability is that vulnerability is actually a huge source of strength, because if I'm vulnerable, or more importantly, if I respond to someone else's vulnerability with vulnerability of my own, we will feel closer to each other and will like and trust each other more.
You had mentioned earlier when we first started talking about neural entrainment. And you mentioned it really quickly, but what exactly is neural entrainment?
Yeah. So during a conversation, there's these changes in our bodies and our brains. So even in this conversation,
Mhm.
it we're not aware of it, but you and I have started breathing at a similar rate. Our heart
Mhm.
rates have started to match each other.
Mhm.
It's very likely, given that we're both sitting in sunny environments, that our pupils have started to dilate at the same rate, even though they're separated by thousands of miles.
Right.
And most importantly, during this conversation, the activity within my brain and the activity within your brain have become more and more similar. Right? If we were to
Mhm.
actually hook ourselves up to MRIs or fMRIs, what we would see is that our brains start to look similar to each other. And that actually makes sense when you think about it, because if I describe to you that a feeling that I'm having or an idea, you actually experience that feeling a little bit, right? You experience that idea a little bit.
Mhm.
And and it makes sense that our brains would look a little bit similar. The more similar our brains become, the better we understand each other, the better we're able to hear each other. And so the goal of communication in many ways is to cause your brains to align. And this is known as neural entrainment in neuroscience.
Mhm.
And what it says is that basically, as we're having a conversation, you and I will start to think alike. And that's the thing that will make us feel like we understand each other, help us understand each other, and make us feel close.
Where did you first turn? Like, I'm curious about some of the books and researchers that you turned to for the book. Like, what was some of your source material for the book? Like, that really was foundational and super helpful for writing.
Oh, so when it comes to neural entrainment, there's a handful of researchers who've been working on this for about 10 or 15 years. So
Hmm.
there's a guy named Uri Hassan at Princeton, and a woman named Talia Wheatley at Dartmouth. She had a grad student named Bo Sievers, who I spent a lot of time looking at his research. Um, there's a guy named Matt Lieberman at UCLA who looks at basically social conversations and what happens inside our brains.
Hmm.
So, I mean, the way that I write books is I just spend a tremendous amount of time doing internet research, right? I use Google
Right.
Scholar.
Yeah.
And then when I find a paper that I think is interesting or a researcher who seems like they're doing interesting work, I call them up almost as fast as I can. Like
Hmm.
it's always a mistake to read instead of having a conversation. So my
Hmm.
goal is to read as much as I need to in order to call someone and not embarrass myself. And then usually when I call them, what I say is something like, I've read a bunch of your papers and this is what's interesting to me about them, but I don't know enough to actually know the right questions to ask you. Can you tell me what I ought to ask you? And you just do that enough times and you end up finding out some good stuff.
Yeah. Years ago, I did a class with Marshall Rosenberg. I don't know if you came across that guy. It's
No.
the book is called Nonviolent Communication,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and it was super helpful. Like, just to basically, a big part of it was just like acknowledging how somebody is feeling. So I,
Yes.
I wanted to go into that. You mentioned the three different types of conversations that we can have, and
Yeah.
the confusion of knowing where you are, what kind of conversation you're trying to have. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how do you determine like what the goal of a conversation is, or what kind of conversation those three buckets we are in.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing is the goal of a conversation. The goal of every conversation is at its most elemental level the same, which is to understand how you see the world and to speak in such a way that you can understand me, right? And then when we get focused on that goal, it makes things a lot easier. So the goal is not to convince you I'm right and you're wrong. It's not to convince you that you should like me or admire me. The goal
But
is
don't you
simply
think a lot of conversation is exactly the opposite? Like, I'm
that
right and you are wrong.
yeah, no, that's a trap
Right?
we fall into. Those
Right.
usually aren't great conversations,
Aren't good
right? And
conversations, right?
and they're certainly not conversations where a lot of people walk away being like, "Oh, you know what? You're right.
That
I am wrong," right?
yeah, you're right.
So
That
so
never happens.
the thing that we should remind ourselves is the goal of this conversation is to understand each other. And if we walk away from this conversation still disagreeing with each other, still thinking you're an idiot and I'm not,
Mhm.
but we understand each other better, then that conversation has been a success, right?
Right.
Because we've become entrained. We've connected with each other at least to some degree. So the next question is how do we figure out what kind of conversation this is?
Yeah.
And there's basically two answers. The first is oftentimes asking those deep questions helps a lot. Because if I
Mhm.
ask you a deep question, you kind of tell me what mindset you're in. Think about the difference between someone who I say, "Hey, why did you decide to become a doctor?" And they say something like, I really wanted a steady job and I knew that there was always going to be demand for doctors. That person is probably in a practical mindset, right? They're looking at things practically.
Yeah,
That
right.
same person in a different setting, I asked that same question, they could say, my dad got sick when I was a kid. And like I
Right.
saw how the nurses and the physicians helped him, and I wanted to be one of those people. Okay, that person is in a much more emotional or perhaps social mindset. So
Mhm.
asking a deep question allows the other person to tell us what kind of mindset they're in. But then equally, oftentimes, if we just look for clues, we find them pretty easily, right? Usually it's not that we're in the wrong kind of conversation because it's hard to know what the other person is thinking or feeling. Usually it's because we're not looking for what the other person is thinking or feeling, right?
Mhm.
I,
Right.
my wife comes home with a problem and I start giving her advice right away.
Yep.
It's not because I can't figure out what's going on inside her head. It's because I haven't stopped to bother to figure out what's going on inside her
Right,
head.
right. So you really need to make this a huge priority. Like, if it's not a priority and a goal, it's gonna be really hard to develop this. Like, it's just not gonna
Yeah,
happen.
but
It's
what's
gotta be a
interesting
conscious
is,
choice to
yeah, it can feel overwhelming to get like all
yes.
this advice
Yeah.
but again, super communication is our superpower, right? Homo sapiens have succeeded because we communicate so well. And our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication. And as a result, when we learn a skill and we practice it once or twice or 3 times, it becomes a habit very, very quickly. Our brain is basically designed to make these skills into habits almost immediately.
Mhm.
And so it can feel overwhelming when someone describes it to us. But if you just practice it a little bit,
Right.
it becomes incredibly habitual.
And fun.
Yeah. Yeah. And easy.
Yeah. I like last night, I really enjoyed using some of these principles. I wanted to talk a little bit about hard conversations and some guidelines
Mhm.
you have for going into hard conversations. Just my wife and I went through this, may be too much personal information, but
No.
mediation with uh my wife's divorced, and it's the father of her children and his new wife. So the four of us did mediation. It was very, emotional, a lot of baggage from the
Yeah.
past. Talk to me a little bit about, and there was a mediator who was
Yeah.
organizing and coaching us along the way, but it was very difficult.
So can
I
I
want to
ask you
hear.
what
Yeah.
was the most difficult part of it? Like what did you find to be really challenging?
It's the baggage of their history, the 2 of them, that churns up, and I know her side of the story. There's 2 sides to every story, obviously, but it churns up a lot of emotion in both of them. So there's still, like,
Yeah.
a lot of, I guess, like, trauma that's still, like, unresolved, that the mediator said, "Don't bring up the past." Well, we're not even gonna go there. But it's hard because the emotions are almost, like, in the body as you're talking about this, the daily things that we're having issues with, about money or time or things like that. It's like the emotion is so in the body.
Yeah. And did you find when that would come up, how would it derail things?
At one point, the mediator had to call a timeout and separate us.
Because
So
everyone was
it
getting so
just got,
heated?
the 2 of them were the
And paint
my
that out for me. What was actually happening? Were they screaming at each other? Were
no, it
they
wasn't screaming. It was just like, some name calling kind of stuff. Like, uh, I don't want to say character assassination, but like, just calling into question how good of a parent are you really?
Yeah. And do you feel were either of them listening to each other at that point?
I don't think so. No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah. So here's one of the
I
things
think
that we
they
know.
can't. I think they really
It's
can't
hard. It's
hear
really
each
hard.
other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So here's one of the things that we know about conflict conversations. Conversations where we disagree with someone or we're talking about something really sensitive like our
Yeah.
kids or politics or religion or
Right.
race. There is one of the things that can derail us is that we all have a sneaking suspicion in the back of our mind, particularly during conflict conversations, that the other person is not listening to us. They're just waiting their turn to speak. Right? I'm going to tell
Absolutely.
you what a terrible parent you are.
Yep.
And like, you're going to be like, it's not even going to register. You're just going to tell me what a terrible parent I am. Right?
Exactly.
So we have to figure out not only how do we get around that, but how do we convince ourselves to actually listen?
Mhm.
How do we prove that we're listening to someone so that it doesn't become us just waiting our turn to yell at each other?
Right.
And there's actually a technique that's taught at Harvard and Stanford, a bunch of other places, that's known as looping for understanding, and it has 3
Mhm.
steps. The first step is you ask a question, preferably a deep question,
Mhm.
and then you let the other person answer. Step 2 is once they're done answering and you let them take as long as they want, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say,
Mhm.
right? Don't mimic them,
Right.
but actually prove to them that you were paying attention, you were processing what they were saying, you're thinking about it. And then step 3, and this is the one we always forget, ask if you got it right. Because one
Mhm.
of 2 things will happen. The first thing is that they might say, "No, you didn't understand what I was trying to say," which is useful to know that we
Right.
we we didn't hear them correctly. Or they might say, "Yeah, I think you understood what I was trying to say." And what's happening in that moment is that we are asking them for permission to acknowledge that we were listening.
Right.
And another thing about our neurology is that when we believe someone is listening to us, we become more likely to listen to them.
Mhm.
And the other reason why this technique is so important is because exactly what you just said, they
Would you
couldn't
call that
listen
a
to each other.
bid? A bid for,
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways of kind of, in John Gottman and his wife sort of they call
yes,
about
yeah,
bids and yeah, it's all the same stuff. It's sort of a different
right,
nomenclature around it.
right.
But what's important is you mentioned, it was hard for them to actually listen to each other. Like so what happens is that when I get in that fight or flight mindset,
Mhm.
it does become very hard. Even if I want to listen to you, it becomes very hard for me to listen.
Right.
Now, on the other hand, though, if I give myself an assignment, and that assignment is I need to listen to you so closely that I can repeat back what you've said in my own words.
Mhm.
Now I've actually kind of hacked my own brain, because in order to fulfill that goal, I can't come up with counter arguments as you're speaking. I really have to pay attention to what you're saying. I might even have to
Right.
take notes if it's something really, really heated and complicated. So what this does is not only does it try and prove to the other person that I'm listening to them, which helps lower the temperature, it
Mhm.
actually makes it easier for me to listen, because now I have an assignment for myself, not come up with all the reasons you're a jerk while you
Right.
talk, but rather listen closely enough that I can repeat back to you what I think you're saying.
The mediator did something interesting right off the bat. Was she had a whiteboard, and she said, just asked each the four of us what our individual goals were, and kind of the rules of the road for what was going to transpire, which was a 2 hour, emotional meeting. So
Yeah.
it was very useful to kind of
And
get.
did you guys come to a resolution? Like, did it
We
help?
did. It actually it was very good. Ultimately, like, there was a lot of give and take. They gave a little, we gave a little, and it was I was dreading it in some ways, like doing I'd never done mediation, and actually was a pretty good experience of watching this mediator who's very skillful interact with all of us, and like how she navigated the entire, very difficult, challenging conversation.
And why do you think it worked? What was it about that experience that helped you guys hear each other?
She Because of her being in place, like calling kind of timeouts at times, or pointing out when the conversation like did derail and go into like negative town or blame town or whatever you want to call it, just having that outside coach who's not in their lizard brain was
Yeah.
really useful to be able to navigate the whole thing. Otherwise, I don't think it could have happened.
And my guess is, and tell me if this is wrong, my guess is that at some point she said something like, okay, like, before we start talking about solutions, let's just like kind of talk about how we feel about this. Like, let's get on the table all the things that are happening inside our brain that like we think are
Yes.
important to this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then at
Exactly.
another moment, she probably said something like, okay, it, I know that you're feeling a lot, but let's look at solutions now. Let's not, when you
She
feel
was.
those emotions, just go ahead
Yes.
and now's the time to sort of set them aside. And we're going to talk about. So I think one of the things that she was probably doing that's really helpful, and this is what mediators are trained in, is she was helping you guys figure out how to have the same conversation at the same moment. Because
Right.
if I come in and I say, "Hey, here's my proposal, proposed solution for how we split up the kids,"
Mhm.
and you say, "I hate you because you cheated on me," we're probably not like you're having an emotional conversation. I'm having a practical conversation. I
Yeah.
might even, I might be feeling very emotional myself, and I try and, but my habit is to speak in a practical manner, and so I'm
Right.
couching all of my emotional feelings in practical language, and
Mhm.
just having someone who says, "Now's the time for an emotional conversation. Now's the time for a social conversation. How does this affect the other kids? Now's the
Right.
time for a practical conversation. What's a workable plan?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing is, we can do that for ourselves, right? It's really useful to have a mediator do it for us,
Mhm.
but we can equally do it well ourselves and say, look, like, let's take a couple of minutes just to talk about how we feel. And I'm not going to tell you that your feelings are wrong. I'm going to acknowledge your feelings. I'm going to say, like, I understand you're feeling this way, and that probably doesn't feel great. And
Right.
after we do that, let's talk about solutions. And that act of figuring out how to have the same conversation at the same time,
Mhm.
that's really, really powerful. And in fact, they
R
teach it in schools to teachers. They teach teachers that when a student comes to you and they want to have a real conversation,
Mhm.
start it by asking them, do you want to be helped?
Right.
Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard?
I like
And
that.
that, of course, is like, the practical, the social, and the emotional conversation.
Helped,
And
heard, or hugged.
or heard, helped,
Yeah.
hugged, or heard.
Helped,
And
hugged, heard.
the thing is, every student knows what they want.
Right.
They are able to say, I want to be helped, or I want to be hugged. I'm feeling bad. Or I
Yeah.
just want you to hear what's going on right now. Like, this is like, you don't have to solve the problem, but I want you to tell me that, like, this is
Yeah.
this is this is something that's happening. I'm not crazy.
That's
And
super useful. I'm gonna try this
we
tonight.
yeah, and we know how to do this. We We intuitively know how to answer that question. It's
Right.
just a matter of teaching ourselves to ask it.
Yeah. Just real quickly, what are your hopes for the book? Do you have any
I
thoughts on
mean,
how
what I
you?
really hope is that people read it and that they get a sense of how to connect to the people they want to connect with. The thing is that like we don't have to have conversations with anyone we don't want to have conversations with, right? Like sometimes you get in the Uber and you don't want to talk to the driver. You just want to check your
Right.
your email, right? And that's
Right.
okay. That's totally
Mhm.
fine. Sometimes we come home and we don't want to like have a conversation with our spouse. We want to watch TV and like just chill
Exactly.
out.
Mhm.
But what is important is that when we do want to have conversations, when we do want to connect with someone,
Yeah.
that we have the skills, the tools available to us in order to make that a success.
Yeah.
And so that's my goal for the book. My hope for the book is that people read it and they say, oh, look, here's a handful of skills that I can practice.
Yep.
And then when I practice them, they become habits pretty quickly. And the next time I want to have a conversation, the next time I want to connect to someone, the next time I want to talk about something important, I know how to do it
Yeah.
rather than just feeling like I'm lost.
Right. You've got the tools in the toolbox.
Yeah.
This has been fun, Charles. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the the copy of the book. Really enjoyed reading it, and this has
Oh,
been a
thanks for
pleasure.
having me.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
best of luck. I hope the book continues to
Thanks.
do well, and I'm looking forward to having this come out and be released in a few weeks.
Me too. Me too. Thank you so
Real
much.
quickly, how can
Yeah.
people get in touch with you or learn more about your
Yeah. Yeah.
books and get in touch with you?
If they just Google me, Charles Duhigg, Duhigg, my website will come up, or if they Google the power of habit or supercommunicators, you'll find me
Yeah,
pretty quickly. And
easy
there's
to
a bunch
find you.
of contact information on my website, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram and
Yeah,
all of
there are
the
not
all
too
of the
many Duhiggs
things.
out there, right?
Not too many Duhiggs. No, I'm the only
Cool,
one.
cool. Well, thanks, Charles. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
By learning some principles, applying it by publishing it, and then revamping it over and over. So it was a way to amplify your writing to the world much better. And think about it. When you write, not only are you writing on social media, if that's your bag, but you're writing emails to sell things, you're writing sales emails, you're writing product pages, you're reaching out to people, you're putting pages on Google local listings. You're doing a lot of writing that you may not know. And if you can make every single piece of writing 10%, 20%, 100% better, imagine the results that compound from that.
Yeah.
And that's what the copywriting course is about.